This is Parish Emergency Operations Planning Session 4, completing the functional annexes. I'm going to begin with a brief reminder from Session 1. An emergency operations plan is made up of 3 parts. There's the basic plan that defines who the plan serves, provides contact information, identifies who created the plan, and how the disaster is managed. It also helps us understand the response capabilities and resources available to us in an emergency. That's what we worked on up to this point. Before we could write these annexes, we needed to develop a plan that described how your parish manages and communicates in an emergency. We needed a clear picture of who your plan serves and the needs of your congregation. Who's in charge? How do you communicate within your parish and with the community? Who has the authority to activate the plan? Who speaks on behalf of the parish to local responders? What resources are available to you in an emergency? What special needs exist within your parish family? These are all important aspects that needed to be considered before we could decide what appropriate response actions might be. You should have completed this information in the first 2 webinars using the templates provided. Last month, we focused on completion of the fire annex and encourage you to move on with your tornado annex. We'll now discuss development of the functional annexes. The functional annexes are procedures that are common to many types of disasters, such as evacuation, reunification, or your communication plan. These types of activities would be the same no matter what the nature of the emergency. Some of you have already written emergency response plans that contain much of the information needed to complete these annexes. Do not start over with your planning efforts, but instead use this process to determine if the information you've already developed is complete. In our old method of planning, we often focus solely on how we respond to an incident once it has occurred. Remember, this is an emergency operations plan, not just an emergency response plan. We develop our plan to cover all areas of the emergency, including prevention, preparedness, response, and recovery. This assures that we have a fully comprehensive plan that takes us from activities we can conduct before the incident occurs all the way to recovery efforts after the emergency has passed. This approach helps to create a culture of preparedness throughout our organization and ensures that our plans are living documents relevant to our daily operations. In Session 1, you completed an assessment of the threats most relevant to your parish. Most likely your list includes tornadoes, severe weather, fire, active intruder, cyber attack, or an influenza outbreak. Last month, we discussed the development of the threat annexes and encourage you to start with the fire annex. You should continue on this month with your tornado annex if you haven't already done so. We'll cover the active intruder and cyber attack annexes in the months to come. These are a bit more complex and we'll be providing subject matter experts. Let's begin by developing the evacuation annex for your plan. Recall that the functional annexes include all the activities necessary to respond to a threat that are done consistently in any emergency. For example, whether you're evacuating your facility for a bomb threat or a gas leak, the process of evacuation is always the same. We start by establishing the goals and objectives for each function, just like we did for our threat annex. If needed, go back and review Session 3 webinar on development of the threat annexes. This process is very similar, but this time we want our goals, objectives, and actions to apply to any type of an emergency, not just a fire. Again, we ask the basic questions we asked ourselves at the onset of developing any plan. What is our desired outcome, and how are we going to achieve it? In our old method of planning, or perhaps in the development of your existing emergency plans, you may have focused solely on how to respond to an incident once it occurred. Remember, in this planning process, we're going to include our efforts to better prepare ourselves in advance of the emergency and consider how we might recover in the immediate aftermath. Your team should develop 3 goals for every functional annex: the before, during, and after. Again, goals are very broad statements that essentially say, what is it I want to see happen? Objectives are specific, measurable actions that are necessary to achieve your goals. Each goal will often have multiple objectives. In the goal, we ask ourselves, what is it I want to see happen? With the objectives, we ask, how am I going to do that? We developed our fire threat annex last month, so now we'll discuss the evacuation annex that would be activated in the event of a fire. Of course, the point of a functional annex is that it can be used in any emergency that requires evacuation. If we had a gas leak that required everyone to leave the building, we would not use a different process for moving parishioners. You might follow a different exit, but the activation of the annex, the means for communicating the process, and the manner in which everyone is accounted for following the emergency remains consistent. Here, I've identified my 3 goals before, during, and after the event. Goal 1, before, is to develop a plan to assure the timely evacuation of everyone from the building. Note there's not a prevention piece in the functional annex planning. In the case of a functional annex, it's about preparedness, better preparing ourselves before an emergency occurs. Goal 2, during the event, assure the safe and timely evacuation of all persons, and Goal 3, or after, is to account for all persons and assure their safety and security. These seem like really obvious oversimplified statements, but they really do keep the planning team focused on what they're trying to achieve instead of just randomly brainstorming out-of-order ideas and risking possibly forgetting an important step. Now let's talk about the objectives for the goals I have stated. These are provided as an example for our discussion. Your goals and objectives may be completely different based on the needs of your parish. For my goal of developing processes to assure a timely evacuation, I decided my objectives would be to develop processes, identify assembly areas, develop the courses of action to get everybody out of the building, assign the courses of action to responsible parties, and then train and exercise those individuals according to my plan. Note that I haven't yet listed my courses of action. I want to decide what all of my objectives are first. For the assembly area, we ideally move people to a warm location where we can determine that everybody is present. In Iowa, that may mean allowing everyone to return to their vehicles if safe. Do not allow people to leave if their exiting interferes with the arrival of first response vehicles. If safe, you may have parishioners wait in their cars until directed to leave. If you select this option, don't forget to add this option to your courses of action and assign a responsible party to direct traffic. Keep in mind, if you are a very small parish, you may end up with more objectives than you have people to carry them out. In this case, you'll have to determine which objectives are critical to life and property. You also may need to limit your courses of action. Moving on, I carried out the same activity of establishing objectives for Goal 2, assuring the safe and timely evacuation of the building. Here my objectives are to assure everyone exits the building, assembles in a designated area, and follows the instructions of the fire and police department upon arrival. I still need to decide which exits will be used and where my designated areas of assembly might be. I'll finish our objectives first. Finally, I complete my objectives for Goal 3 by accounting for the individuals to assure that everyone has exited the building. After all the goals and objectives have been established, the planning team determines the courses of action for accomplishing each. Courses of action address the what, who, when, where, why, and how. Consider each objective and determine first, is it feasible and is it acceptable? We need to think about the specific courses of action necessary in response to an emergency to help determine if the objectives are feasible. For example, if the time required to carry out the task is longer than the actual event occurs, it may be unnecessary. Or, if the course of action requires equipment and resources that we don't own, then the objective becomes impossible. Include only objectives and courses of actions that fall within your capabilities and available resources. Use the information you gathered in developing your basic plan to remind you of the limits of staffing and resources to assure you remain within your capabilities. Note, we still have not identified specific procedures for carrying out these tasks. In some cases, it may not be necessary. In more complex actions, it may be critical. Specific procedures are typically not included in the plan, but would be included in a standard operating procedures guide or the guidelines provided each staff or volunteer position. For example, if ushers are responsible for clearing the sanctuary should evacuation become necessary during Mass, the procedures for doing this might be included in an usher's guidebook or manual. More on this at the end of our slides. You may have already developed information on goals and objectives and courses of action in your existing parish emergency plan. Use that information to assist you in completion of this section or update that plan using the process described in this session. This provides an excellent opportunity to review your plan and assure that you have the capabilities and resources to carry it out. I would like you to use the same activity and move on to the functional annex for sheltering in place. This annex would be used in the event a tornado warning is issued during a church event or inclement weather leaves parishioners temporarily stranded in the building. Use the method of planning we just completed for the evacuation annex to determine your shelter in place annex. How would you use this activity to develop a plan for sheltering during a tornado? What would be your before, during, and after goals? How would you ensure all persons in the facility are guided to shelter in a timely manner? Who would be responsible for carrying out these courses of action? As a point of clarification, this annex is not the plan you would use for long-term sheltering in a disaster. If your parish is used for a long-term shelter during a disaster, the facility would fall under your county emergency hazard mitigation plan. If you're interested in working with your county to provide your facility as a group shelter in a disaster, you can contact me or your county emergency manager. We still have parts 6 through 10 of our basic plan to complete. These sections are almost easier to fill in as you go through the process of developing your threat and functional annexes. For Part 6, information referenced to complete your courses of action should be recorded as you go through the planning process. For example, if it's necessary to monitor the weather in a tornado or severe weather annex, then what source of information on weather are you using? Who monitors this source? Who analyzes the information collected? This list is included in the information collection and dissemination section of your basic plan. The references included in this section may only be obvious as you go through the planning process. The same rule applies to authorities and references used in the development of the plan. If you reference Iowa code language or diocese policy documents, you include them here. Training and exercise schedules can be determined as you continue to plan, and administrative and finance options may also be discussed later. Finally, the logistics of how your actions are carried out can only be determined after you figure out what your courses of action involve. Given all this, I encourage you to keep records as you develop your plan, which will make your job a lot easier when completing the last 5 parts of the basic plan. For next month, I'd like to see you establish the goals and objectives for your evacuation annex. Identify the courses of action needed to achieve these goals and objectives. Time permitting, move on and complete the shelter-in-place annex or any other annexes you may be comfortable addressing. Sometimes these annexes are easier to complete if you apply them to some kind of a scenario. Think about a scenario that may function to help you complete these annexes and talk through the process with your group as you consider your courses of action. Next month, we'll meet on February 20th at 2 o'clock. Cybersecurity and the threat annex associated with that will be discussed at that time. If you have any questions or you need assistance as you complete your plan, remember you can always contact me via email or give me a call. I'll be happy to help you out or answer any questions you may have. I also can join your planning team if you'd like via any of these Zoom video meetings. I'd be happy to help you out. Thanks so much.